Dr. Winkle, could you, on the Zoom, could you, if that's okay? Okay. My name is Tiffany R. Smith, and my dissertation is entitled Framing the Queen, Black Masking Indian Women in the Visual and Cultural Archive of New Orleans. So I'm here to discuss the Black masking Indian queens, women whose labor has sustained the tradition, yet remain almost invisible in the very media and scholarship that documents it. This dissertation is grounded in one central question: where are all the Black women? That question emerged in my 2022 research methods class when I dug into the Mardi Gras Indian literature and found the queens were almost entirely absent. They were treated as accessories to the tradition or barely mentioned at all. There was only one published piece at the time, which was the first to censor the queen's cultural bearing and civic roles within the tradition. Everything else sidelined them, framing queens through their ties to men rather than their own leadership. My curiosity grew over 3 years. I drove to New Orleans, attended Super Sundays, Mardi Gras mornings, and took photos of the queens. I realized that this erasure wasn't accidental, it was structural. It mirrors decades of how media frames this tradition, censoring men while rendering women's foundational work invisible. So now I just want to provide a little bit of background about the Black masking Indians and the Queen specifically. So before we get to the problem, I want to establish the historical groundings. The Black masking Indian tradition emerged from centuries of resistance and cultural reclamation. Between 1719 and 1743, enslaved people of the Kingdom of Congo, Senegambia, and other West African regions were forcibly brought to New Orleans. They gathered in Congo Square, a space where they could practice their ancestral rituals and their spiritual technologies of survival. Over generations, Black men and Creole men of mixed African and Native descent developed the Black masking Indian traditions in the 1880s. So I want to make clear that this tradition was started by Afro-Indigenous men in the early days. And these weren't costumes. They were sacred vessels embodying resistance, creativity, and identity. Each suit hand-sewn, each bead placed with intention, connecting the wearers to their ancestors and their refusal to be erased. But what about the queens? So they officially became members of the tribes around the 1970s. The earliest documented images I could locate are from the 1970s, photographed by Michael P. Smith. So here are some images here from the New Orleans Historic Collective archive of Queen Barbara Sparks and Queen Rita Johnson. We don't have a clear historical record of who the first queen was, but the silence around their arrival tells us something important. When Black women's labor enters a tradition, the archive forgets to name it. I also want to put a timer on really quick because I forgot to turn my timer on. 10 more minutes, perfect. Okay. So the problem. This brings me to the core problem driving this work. Despite the Queen's foundational role in sustaining the tradition, they remain persistently invisible, and I mean deliberately invisible across 3 dimensions. So the first dimension is the scholarly gap. I mentioned there's only one published article, and even to this day in 2026, there's still only one published official piece in terms of research that centers the Black masking Indian queens. Meanwhile, hundreds of articles, books, documentaries, and oral histories have been produced about the tradition, about the chiefs, and about the men. The queens are mentioned in passing, if at all. This isn't a gap in coverage, it's structural erasure. The second is the visible invisibility. My analysis examined 276 images from local newspapers in New Orleans published in 1995 until 2025. And here's what I found. 80.4% of those images featured only male tribe members. Only 19.2% included a queen at all. And even when queens appeared, they were right there in the frame. When they were right there in the frame, they were positioned as supportive figures, not central subjects. Their labor rendered hyper visible, their authority invisible. And lastly, the intersectional erasure. This pattern mirrors what Black feminist scholars call the white gaze, a system of racialized and gender subjugation that renders Black women hyper visible in their labor while erasing their agency, their knowledge, and their authority. Black women's bodies are expected to show up, hold things together, look beautiful, but never to be recognized as carriers of knowledge. The big question became, what would it mean to center the Queen's own readings of these images, to ask them what was missing, to let them interpret the archive? So that now leads to my research questions. And so this work is guided by 2 interconnected research questions. The first one is, how have local news media visually represented the Black masking Indian queens from 1995 to 2025? And secondly, what do these visual narratives reveal about their agency, labor, and cultural authority? And I also named that most of the color images in the presentation are images that I've taken over the years. So video images, video and images that I've taken. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. But this is also some of the grounded work that I've been doing over the years visually. So now for the theoretical framework. This work sits at the intersection of three theoretical frameworks who they all work interconnectedly. But first is the Black feminist epistemology, which grounds this entire project. Scholars like Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, Tina Kemp, and Cydia Hartman have taught us that the archive is a contested space. What we see and what we refuse to see is political. The archive is not a neutral record. It is a site where power is inscribed through every choice to include, exclude, name, or silence Black women. Secondly, critical visual culture insists that photos are not neutral documentation, they're text. How a photographer frames a queen, whether she's centered or backgrounded or in the background, whether she gazes at the camera or is out of the frame, shapes meaning. Each compositional choice encodes ideology. And lastly is media affirming theory or mass communication theory, which shows that journalists do not simply report facts, they frame narratives. They make certain people salient, certain roles clear, and certain stories worth telling. In the news media archive, in news media, the dominant frame of the chief is the center frame, is center of the frame. The queen remains on the margin. Together, these frameworks argue that the photographic archive is not fixed. As I mentioned, the image can be a tool of misogynoir and a site of critical interpretive possibilities. So then this is where I had to manage how to then what my methodological process would be and how I would study this work. So to answer those research questions, I explored a mixed method design across two studies. So the first study was a critical visual analysis where I analyzed 276 newspaper photos, coding them systematically for visuality, framing, gaze, and other factors, or other codes. This allowed me to quantify the erasure, giving me the numbers that prove what I had suspected. The queens are being systematically written out of the visual archive. Study two uses in-depth interviews with photo elicitation sessions, where I interview 5 big queens, women with experiences from 7 years to 52 years in the tradition. And we looked at we interviewed them. We also looked at images together. I showed them newspaper photos analyzed from study one, and asked them, what do you see? What's missing? What's the truth? What's the truth that this image doesn't show? Photo elicitation is powerful because images invoke deeper consciousness than words alone. The brain allocates 30 to 50% of its capacity to processing visual images versus only 8% to visual processing. For Black masking Indians, whose tradition is deeply visual and aesthetic, the images transported some of them back to memories, to elders, and to emotional truths. So the two studies created a dialogue. Study one quantifies the erasure through the media archive, and study two actualizes the Queen's lived experiences and their refusal to be silent. So in study one, so as I mentioned in study one, I examined 2 newspapers from the years 1995 to 2025, a 30-year window chosen deliberately. It included the decade before Katrina, the storm itself, after Katrina, the pandemic, and the recent surge in media attention around the tradition. If you all remember, I believe in 2024, the Black masking Indians were a part of the Super Bowl in New Orleans in 2024, if I'm correct. I focused on local newspapers, the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate, because national outlets often sensationalize and commodify the tradition. Local journalists have the cultural knowledge, the proximity, and the responsibility to tell their stories with nuance. I searched using keywords such as the Mardi Gras Indians, Black masking Indians, and those searches yielded 4,719 articles initially. So I had to clean 4,000 articles. But I had specific criteria that the articles needed to meet, and those articles needed to have images. So I needed the queens to be visible, present, and identifiable, which narrowed it down to 276 viable images for the study. And so the code book. Now, how do you systematically code a photo? I created a code book using what visual scholars Rodriguez and Dimitrova call the four-tier model. So I focused on the denotative meaning, the semantic aesthetic, the connotative meaning, and the ideological representation. In addition to these qualitative codes, I track quantitative measures such as frequency, naming, prominence, gaze, and narrative framing. And so, for instance, in this image is an example of how I coded the images. And so, as you can see in the image published in the New Orleans Advocate in 2024, the process of coding and analyzing each image in the study was systematically applied to 276 images, where again, I looked at the frame of the image, who was at the center, what was in focus, where their gaze lied. So if you notice too, like the prominence of the women in the image are in the background and midground. You can see that the male or the chief is at the center. And you can also see that the queens are somewhat either out of focus or almost out of the frame completely. And so this, through those 276 images is the process that I took to analyze those images, particularly those that had queens in the photos. Got it. So some key findings from the critical visual analysis. Um, and so, sorry, see, here we go. Okay. So visual presence and visibility. So out of 276 total images, only 53 included a queen. That's just 19.2% of the data set, which means 80.4% of the local newspaper images that was viable for this study featured only men in those images. So again, 80% of those photos only had men in them, right? Um, that is an example of systematic erasure. When we think about image prominence and focus, when the queens did appear in 54 of those images, so 54 images the queens actually appeared, or 53 total images the queens appeared, only 16, so 30.2% centered the queen as the primary focus, right? So of the 53, only 16 images had the queen in the center of the picture. 37 images, 69.8% showed the queen alongside male figures in a supporting role. And 222 images, again, 80.4% either excluded her entirely or relegated her to the back or excluded her, and excluded her entirely. So the photographic gaze, this is critical. Hooke's theories of oppositional gaze teaches us, uh, this is critical. Hooke's theory of oppositional gaze teaches us that a direct gaze, eye contact between the subject and camera signals agency, power, and authority. An averted gaze signals the historical positioning of Black women as to not be looked at or objects rather than subjects. So in this sample, 34%, 18 images show queens with the direct eye contact to the camera. 71.7% of the image did not capture the queen's gaze at all. So either her gaze was looking away, or she just was not looking directly at the camera, which kind of communicates the photographer's focus and who and how they wanted to capture the people that they witnessed or the people that they captured. And then when I analyze these patterns across time, so the story, when I analyzed the pattern across time, the story became more nuanced. So in the 1990s, of the images from the 1990s, which was 32 total articles, 9.4% included a queen. In the 2000s, there were 91 total articles and 9.1% included a queen. In the 2000s, which is after Katrina, which I saw an increase, was a total of 102 articles. So there were an increase of articles that were published about the Mardi Gras Indians, and 22.4% included a queen, which is the highest rate across all 4 decades that I analyzed. And in the 2022, we saw a bit of a dip where there was only about 50 articles published thus far. Obviously, we're only in the first 5 years of the 2020s. And 36% of those included queens. So again, even though there was essentially between 1990 and the 2000s, the queens were often not visible or not within the images. But once we get to the 2010s and beyond, and really post-Katrina, we see an increase of the queens in those images. And this, again, is just a visual representation of the data that I found. Um, So what's significant here in the post-Katrina shift? So after 2005, when the Indians returned to parade despite displacement and devastation, media attention, me, media attention to the entire tradition increased. The queens became slightly more visible, but the increase was inconsistent and never exceeded what I would call robust coverage. In the 2010s, there was a spike. The spike suggests a moment when journalists began to see the queens, perhaps in response to growing scholarship or growing community activism around gender equity in the tradition. But in the 2000s, again, it's the first 5 years, there was a decline despite national attention to the tradition, which tells us that the increased media attention to the tradition does not automatically translate to increased attention to the queens. So next we're going to move over to study two. So that was my results from study one, and I'll talk about both the results in conversation after this. But this is study two, which is the in-depth interviews. So study one gives us what's been erased. Study two gives us why and how the queens contested. So for study two, I conducted 5 semi-structured in-depth interviews with queens representing different tribes, different wards, and different tenures within the tradition. And so I gave them pseudo names, right? The Queen Indigo Sky was a part of the tradition for 7 years, Emerald Queen or Emerald Wave, 10 years, Queen Ruby Red, 28 years, Queen Violent Flame, 51, and Queen Golden Dawn, 52 years. And so within these interviews, each interview lasted about 60 to 75 minutes and followed a 5-part protocol that asked the queens about identity and role. So how did they become a queen? What does it mean to be a queen? 2, which is memory and ancestry. What do you remember about elder queens? What do you carry from them? 3 is media representation. How do media images feel to you? So meaning when they saw images within the media, what did it elicit? What response did they have? And then what was missing to them in the media? Visual narrative. So this is the photo elicitation section. So I showed them various photos, like one of these, the image that's here. This is one of the photos that I showed during the photo elicitation. And I asked them about the archive. What did they see? What was true? What was missing? I essentially asked them to read the photo and a reflection and co-creation. So how do you want to be remembered? What story do you want to tell? And also asking them, what did I not ask that you would want me to know? So why does photo elicitation matter? So of course, most people or most researchers, quantitative researchers, conduct in-depth interviews, but I chose photo elicitation because the key methodological move was embedding photo elicitation within the broader interview. Harper, 2002 describes photo elicitation as a postmodern dialogue that decenters the researcher and positions the participant as the authority. As an outsider to the tradition and as an artist and scholar myself, but not as a Black masculine Indian and not from New Orleans, I had some knowledge gaps. I could analyze the media archive, but I couldn't generate the emotional or embodied knowledge that comes from being a queen, from being from New Orleans. When I show images, I said to them, "Here's what the media capture. What you're reading. What truth does the image not contain?" Also, part of that was that I also came with a particular, I wouldn't say bias, but a particular perspective that might have potentially when we think about patriarchy, I think I have a particular perspective that may or may not feel the same way for the queens, or they may not express it in the same way, right? And so I needed to kind of get out of the way to allow them to talk about what pride existed for them as they move and exist as queens. And I'll kind of I'll move a little quick because I know I'm running on time. So some key themes that came from the in-depth interviews with photo elicitation is that 8 themes emerged, and I'll just go into a few of those themes. So as you see on the screen, this is the coded category for those themes. So when I did the interviews, is the coded categories, and these are just quotes from each of the queens on the right side. So we think about cultural preservation and spiritual label. So Queen Violet Flame said, "We sow the dreams they photograph." I found this statement profound because it articulates that the Queen's creative spirit and spiritual labor precedes the media's documentation. The suit is not made for the photograph. The photograph documents the suit. But in media framing, it's often the reverse. The suit becomes an object for visual consumption and the Queen's labor becomes invisible. I'll go to theme 3, which is gender dynamics and invisible labor. So Queen Ruby Red said that she describes her role as the one that people call when something goes wrong. I'm the secretary. I'm the one that keeps the gang together and on time. And then Queen Violet Flame also echoed, your job is to keep the tribe together. You're the backbone of everything. You have to be supportive. This reveals a crucial reality. The Queen's labor is relational, emotional, administrative, spiritual. It's the work, it's the work that makes the tradition function. Yet it is rendered invisible in media because it's not spectacle. It's not performative or on stage. It happens in meetings and phone calls and emotional labor and holding people together. And I also mentioned that in those gender dynamics, the queens also have an organization that they spend time together and were able to build and kind of talk through things that only them as women could experience with their organization called Queens of the Nation. So they have found a way to build with each other and show up for each other because there were years where queens from uptown and downtown never knew each other or were never in relationship. I'm gonna move ahead a little bit. And so these are some other key findings again from the full 8, but just again for time, I want to continue to move forward. So integration. So study 1 quantifies the erasure of the Black masculine Indian queens, and study 2 actualizes their experiences. Okay, here it is. So now how does study 1 and study 2 speak to each other, and what does the integration reveal? Study 1 quantifies the erasure. It proves numerically that the queens are systematically pushed to the margins of the visual archive. 80.4% of the images excluded them. When they did appear, they were backgrounded. When named, it was often after the chiefs are named. This is structural, consistent, and it is documented. Study 2 actualized the lived experience of the erasure, but it also reveals something study 1 cannot: the queen's refusal of invisibility. When study 1 shows that only 34% of the queens make direct eye contact with the camera, study 2 provides context. Queen Violet Flame explains that she chose her gaze strategically, sometimes engaging with the camera, sometimes not, depending on what the moment called for. Also, this was an act of rejection because oftentimes there are photographers or media makers who are there who don't greet the queens, who don't show respect to the queens. And so even sometimes their gaze was an act of defiance to resist the images being taken of them that sometimes they didn't approve or just were not met with a level of respect, but were treated as spectacle. She's not passively being photographed. She's making compositional choices about how she wants to be seen. When study 1 documents that 71.7% of the image don't censor the queen's gaze, study 2 shows the queen's naming that absence. We are not maids. We are not the background. The integration reveals a paradox. The archive shows erasure, but the queens are not erased. They're actively interrupting that erasure through their own testimonies, their own interpretive work, and also in this selflessness that they don't always feel like they need the limelight or need the shine. Like they genuinely love what they do. And a lot of the times they just want to be respected in the work that they do. So what does this mean theoretically? Using Patricia Hill Collins' concept of controlling images, the idea is that Black women are rendered hyper invisible in their labor, but invisible as knowers. We see that the media archive is one site where the controlling images operate. But the Queen's testimony disrupt that by censoring their gaze, their voice, their interpretation. We move from a framework of victimhood and a framework to resistance and knowledge. The Queens are historians of their own tradition. They hold the embodied knowledge that no media archive can capture. They know the spiritual technology of masking. They know the labor that holds the tribe together, and they are insisting on being seen and heard. Okay, and last thing, what does it mean for media and journalism? News media functions as gatekeepers of visibility. Decisions about who to photograph, how to frame them, whether to name them, all shapes public memory. The analysis shows that journalists have access to the queens. They could censor them, but structural bias, so patriarchy, misogynoir, prioritizes male leadership and the commercial interest that emphasizes spectacle over spirituality, which means that those decisions aren't made to censor the queens. Changing this remains a deliberate intervention. It requires photographers asking, am I censoring the people who sustain the tradition? Am I documenting their labor, their knowledge, their authority? Also, am I documenting them outside of the Super Sunday, St. Joseph's Night traditions? Am I documenting them in their community work that they do? Or am I documenting them during their all year long outside of the carnival dates? And so implications and contributions. So first, it is a methodological innovation in mixed methods by combining quantitative, qualitative, visual content analysis with qualitative photo elicitation. I've created a framework that allows me to both measure erasure and listen to lived experiences. These two methods speak to each other. Study 1 proves something is wrong. Study 2 explains what and why. Together, they're more powerful than either alone. Second, it intervenes in the visual cultural research and Black feminist scholarship. This is the first study to systematically analyze media representation of the Black masculine queens and to center their voices as the primary interpreters of that representation. It positions the queens as scholars and historians, not as subjects to be studied, but as knowers whose interpretations are authoritative. And I also just want to name that this is the first inside of journalism and mass communication. I don't want to claim the whole field. And third, it has concrete implications for mass communication and journalism. It exposes how news media can inadvertently or not so inadvertently reproduce patriarchal hierarchies and misogynoir. It asks who it asks who do we make visible, who do we name, who do we position as authorities, and it offers a model for how journalists can do better by censoring people who sustain traditions by documenting their labor and knowledge by refusing the controlling images and also asking them about their images. So just some future research and visual practice. So my first desire would be to conduct a year-long ethnography. So being able to spend time with the queens consistently and just see them all year long, especially to really examine all the ways that they show up that they may not be able to name or that they don't see as labor, but just see a part as their role. I also want to name that I recently, that's extra jazz, but was the recipient of the 2025 Jazz Heritage Festival Fellowship. So I just accepted that this week, and will be working with the Jazz Heritage Festival to bring this work to life. And then lastly is an exhibition and co-archive. So while I'm grateful for this work, I do this work to censor the queens and censor their labor. And so I would love to talk to them to see how they would like for this work to be expanded, but also archived and stored. And lastly, is I just want to thank the queens. I believe there might be one or two queens on the call today, but I just want to say thank you for allowing me to spend time with you to research your tradition because it is a closed society, and trusting me with your story in this work. So yes, I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Congrats.
Hi, y'all. So if y'all would like to, anybody like to ask a question, we'll just take one before we send y'all on y'all way.
I have a question. I was
Oh,
curious about, oh,
um,
can you hear me?
yes, I can.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Trust.
Hello. Excuse the noise in the background. There's a little construction happening, but I was wondering, as most of us know, you're also a photographer, and have interacted with the queens through that sort of lens, no pun intended. And I'm curious to hear how that might have informed your work.
Hmm. Yeah, I think before I was able to come to this work as a dissertation, it I actually felt like I filled in the gap that was missing. So because I kept seeing them, not seeing them, right? Or when I would go out and I would see photographers kind of like hawk the flag boy or the spy boy, it just made me focus on the queen. So I think through my photography, I was able to like practice it first, and then study it. So yeah, so it's felt really hand in hand, and I'm glad that my committee allowed me to explore this in this way because uh I wouldn't say this was a risky practice, but I took some risk in doing this, and so I'm grateful that my committee allowed me to really explore it the way that I wanted to. So,
Thank you. This is amazing.
thank you. Oh, okay, y'all, we running on time, so I thank y'all so much. I love y'all. Text me, and I see y'all later. And thank y'all for coming. Hi, Daddy, love you.
Love you, Tiffany.
Hi, sister.
Right.
Yeah, bye, y'all. See y'all later.
Congrats.
Thank you. Love y'all. Love you. Bye.
Good job. You
Love
look
you.
good. Haircut look good too.
Love you. Thank you,
Yeah.
my sister. Bye.